Boring.
So boring. We have lots of things we could talk about that are interesting.
Well, what's the subject matter of the Parsha?
The
Mishkan.
Mishkan,
Yeah.
Which is what?
the traveling
The
tabernacle.
tabernacle.
Okay. Um, and
Like the name
and
of a rock group, the Traveling Tabernacle.
could be, could be. And why bother? Like what's the point of that? What's it all about, Alfie? In other words, why why do they have to build this thing? So um
They were
one po
bored.
one possible Judy, were you going to say something?
I said they were bored.
They were poor.
They needed something to do to make them cohesive. And I was listening to Ben Creshtool and Cantor Ellentuck,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
their thought was that this was maybe a resolution after the golden calf, possibly.
Okay. Okay. What's the problem with that, though? The golden calf hasn't happened yet.
So then he said there was something about the um, things not being in order.
Okay. All right.
I don't remember the word,
All right. Take a
There's,
look at that. We'll take a look at that. Richie, go ahead.
but they already got the Ten Commandments.
yeah.
Yes, but the order of the Parshayot is that the way it happens in the sense of the Torah giving us the text is you have the Ten Commandment episode at Sinai, um, and then you have Parshat Mishpatim, which is just like a series of laws about disparate subjects, and then you get here Truma, where you start getting all this information about building the tabernacle, and then you're going to get to the golden calf. Okay? And then you'll get more tabernacle material. So the last half of Exodus is mostly about the building of the tabernacle, and kind of in the middle of that is the golden calf episode. So what we're reading here precedes the parsha where we'll read about the golden calf.
Which will be next week.
Kiti
Um,
Shah.
so that I like
2 weeks, I think, Richie. But yeah, go ahead.
really. Oh, sorry. I like to think that every parsha in Torah is important. I don't like it. It's very common that people sort of diminish the instructions for building the tabernacle and everything as being as important or meaningful as other parts. But I like to think that every part is extremely meaningful. Number one. And number two is that the tabernacle is built so God can dwell, quote, among them. Um, but I very much like the interpretation that it also is God dwelling amo within us. And I think that that's a central part, very meaningful and important part of Judaism, that God is dwelling within us. So I like that, maybe one would say interpretation. And so I think that this parsha is extremely meaningful in that regard.
Okay. All right. Um, all right. Well, so a couple of David, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. In my Chumash, I have a commentary. Excuse me. In Egyptian slavery, Israel had made buildings for the pharaohs. Now they were privileged to expend their labor for God's sake. This, more than anything, concretized their freedom.
Okay. That's a nice idea. That's a nice idea. Um,
What was the word that did what to their freedom?
concretize,
I don't know what that is.
like make concrete, like make it
Oh,
solid.
concrete. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. David Kuntz.
Yeah, I apologize if Richie said this. Uh, what I take from this parsha is there's a specific way to do things. And you can't just do it the way you want to. Like some people are going to make it, well, I'm going to make it 3 feet. And somebody says, no, I'm going to make it 4 feet. There's a very specific way to do it. And by doing that, the Parsha sets a tone for all Judaism that there's a way to do things. And it's not up to the person to deviate from those ways. This is the way you do it. And by doing that, that actually provides a freedom of sorts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and sort of piggybacking on David's the comment that David read. So there is a sense, it's, in other words, it's not freedom from, it's freedom to, if that makes any sense. You when you're free, what do you do with your freedom? And if you think of the structure of the spring holidays, so it feels like spring today. Passover, you're given your freedom, but Passover leads you to Shavuot. Shavuot gives you a whole series of responsibilities because it represents the Torah, the giving and receiving of the Torah. And, a way to understand that is that the freedom of Passover only becomes meaningful in the context of the responsibilities that are given to Israel through the Torah. If you don't have anything to do with your freedom, what's the point, right? So I think there's something to that for sure. So one way to think about it is you have the Sinai experience, which is this huge, this huge moment that reverberates through Jewish life even down to today. And whatever happened there, and however we understand it, or whatever it was, it is remembered as a moment of connection between God and Israel, and it was powerful to the point that we still feel a sense of responsibility from that moment. So the question, partially, I think that the Torah is wrestling with at this point, and maybe Moses is wrestling with this, is when you have a peak experience like that, how do you then move forward and retain some sense of that on a day-to-day basis? It's funny, actually. This morning, was out early walking the dog, and I see a guy walking his golden retriever. He lives in our neighborhood, and he has an Eagles hat on, Philadelphia Eagles hat. So that's exactly what he was doing. You see, the peak moment is the Eagles winning the Super Bowl, right? I guarantee you, when he put that hat on this morning to go outside, he was like, man, that really felt good when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. So how does Judaism do that? And I would suggest that Judaism does that in 4 ways, 4 particular ways, the 4 pillars upon which Judaism rests. Okay. One of those pillars is sacred stories. So these are the narratives that form the consciousness of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people, the Torah, ultimately the Midrashim, but sacred story is one of those pillars. A second pillar is sacred time. That's what you get in Exodus 12, where the Torah lays out the calendar. So sacred time. So sacred stories enable you to carry the Sinai experience. Sacred time enables you to carry the Sinai experience. Sacred deed enables you to carry the Sinai experience. That's Parshat Mishpatim, to David Kuntz's point. Details, things are done in a particular kind of way. There's a system of halakha, of law, that tells you what to do in your life on a day-to-day basis, both religiously and civically and in your business life. So there's sacred story, there's sacred time, there's sacred deed. And the fourth one is sacred space. And sacred space plays out on 3 levels. There is Mikdash Ma'at, which is your home, where you create sacred space. You mark it off by a mezuzah. You have Shabbat in your home. If you have a traditional home, you keep kosher. You daven in that home. The home is sacred space. The synagogue is sacred space. the temple, the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle, the temple, the synagogue. That's one sort of line, but that's sacred space in a kind of in an institutional way, in a communal way. And what's the third sacred space?
Yourself.
That's good, Patty. It's also very modern. So the third sacred space would be the land of Israel. The
Oh,
land of Israel. Yeah. The ancients really didn't think about themselves as individuals, very, very little, very minimally. They thought communally. They thought communally. When they talked about God loving this or that, it wasn't God loves me. They might say God loves us, the Jewish people. So that's a more modern idea. So it's here in Trumah where the Torah begins to explore the idea of sacred space. What does sacred space look like? How does it work? What happens within the sacred space, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to David's point, we get great detail about how the sacred space was supposed to be constructed. So we get information about the ark, what the ark was supposed to look like. We get information about the altar and how the altar was supposed to look and how it was supposed to work. We get information how the size of the tabernacle and what the tent part was made. I mean, just one thing after another after another. Truma Judy is translated as gifts, as gifts, because the beginning of the parsha is take truma, take gifts from the Israelites, and we will use them as their heart indicates them to give, and we will use those gifts to make, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of goes from there. Bob, did you have a question?
Well, it's a question and a comment.
Yeah.
First of all, when you first came on, Rabbi, you said, "What's the Parsha for today?"
Yeah.
So I assume that you didn't know what the Parsha was when you came on, and everything that has evolved since then has been off the cuff. So I'm blown away that without a lot of preparation, you can give us so much knowledge and wisdom. And
I appreciate that, Bob. I'll tell you a quick story. This is about Rav Soloveitchik, who was one of the great, if not the greatest, Jewish thinker of the 20th century. And he taught at Yeshiva University. Now this is off the cuff. He taught at Yeshiva University. His Talmud shiurim his Talmud classes were famous, and people desperately wanted to take Talmud classes with him. He famously walked into class holding the Talmud volume, but had never had notes. He never had notes with him. And people were astonished that in his mind, he could juggle all of the information, and, it was clear. And one day, he's going through one of the classes, and a student raises his hand, and the Rav calls on the student, and this is a true story. And the student says, Rav, with all due respect, I think that that thing that you said is actually this thing. And Soloveitchik pauses for a second, and he's thinking, and suddenly he reaches into his jacket pocket and he pulls out notes for the class, and he checks through the notes, and he says to the student, "You're right. So you can't see it, but I have notes laid out all in front of me." So here, let's.
And,
Right.
and Bob, your observation is very good that Rabbi Schwartz asked which Parsha is for this week. And I want to mention that Rabbi Schwartz, that's as best I know, always asks that question.
I do. But I appreciate the kind thought, Bob.
All right. Now, my second observation was also something that you said, Rabbi, and that was, you said, after we told you, after the name of the Parsha was made, you said, "Oh, that's boring." And we've now spent probably a half an hour talking about details of how boring this is. and how meaningful it is. So you never know when meaning will come into your existence and into your mentality, even if you think something is quote boring. And you've made you may have been overemphasizing the word boring, but you may have been, but you and the group have made this a very insightful thing. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I shouldn't, I mean, when I say boring, I say that really kind of half jokingly.
Right.
To Richie's point, every Torah portion is rich. And there's a famous line in the Mishnah where it says, Hafochbo v'hafochbo v'hakolbo. You turn it and you turn it and everything is in it. It was a favorite line of Rabbi Loeb's, actually. I think in the Mishnah it's been bag. It says that. Uh, how's that for a name? But I think the material is in a way fascinating, and we'll come to that. There's a lot of what we have in this parsha that's still reflected in our sanctuaries today, which is really a striking thing.
Is that in a Pirkei Avot that you?
It's in Pirkei Avot. Yeah.
Um, so Rabbi Schwartz, we might get to it, but just in case we wouldn't, in Exodus 25, 8, that's the line that I was referring to, and I would actually be interested in the Hebrew translation of a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, as being interpreted as within them, to see if that's in the Hebrew or just an interpretation. It's 25:8, and I guess it's the end where it says I don't know.
So the verse is Vasuli Mikdash. It's a famous verse. Cantor sang it last night as his tune for Shalom Aleichem, because there's a tune that goes with it. I don't know where the tune comes from. Vasuli Mikdash. What's asu mean?
Well, oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I see. Vasuli, I see.
So asu means to make.
Make.
Vasuli is me, meaning God, or make for me. Mikdash is the is the word that the text uses for tabernacle. And then it says vishachanti. That's a word that you guys know. What does that mean? Like Shekhinah. Shekhinah, it's the same root. How do you say in Israel, a neighborhood? Shechunah is a neighborhood. Okay. Why? Because it's a place in which people dwell, right? So and Shekhinah is the indwelling of God's presence. So vishachanti, it's verb form, and I will dwell. Bitocham. Now, bitocham means, you see, the thing about it, Richie, the reason this verse catches people's attention is because you would expect God to say, Vasuli mikdash, make for me a tabernacle. Vishachanti bitocho, and I will dwell in it. But it says Vishachanti bitocham, which means I will dwell inside of you. And so that's a verse that's been drashed on many times over the years. What does the English say? I will dwell among them. But a literal translation would be I will dwell in you. B.
In you.
Yeah. Yeah. But not you singular. Again, to get back to Patty's question before, it's not you singular. Bitocham. If it was singular, what would it be? Let's do some grammar. Bitocha, right, would be singular, second person feminine. Bitochech would be, masculine. Bitochech would be feminine. Bitocham, inside you, meaning you, plural, second person plural. So you make this tabernacle for me, and I, God, will dwell in you. And that's why they probably say among them. Or actually, bitocham does mean them. So I will dwell in them.
And shakan, it's in the notes, it says is to rest, not to dwell.
Yeah, that's wrong.
That's wrong.
I mean, it's the same idea because it's all connected, right? If you're dwelling in a place, you are settling there. You are, right? You are resting there, settling there.
But it's not too far, it's not too much of an extension to say within each individual. Is that fair to say?
I think that to me, that is too far of an extension, actually.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really, again, it's hard. We've gotten so far astray from this idea, but um, the covenantal relationship that's sort of unfolding here, right, where you have the giving of the Ten Commandments, you're going to have this sort of this Brit ritual between it's about the relationship between God and Am Yisrael and the people. When it says V'shachanti betocham, I will dwell amongst the people, you know. So I think that this whole idea of God, I mean, it's another conversation which we don't really need to get into right now. But the idea of God and an individual having a personal, loving relationship is much more modern idea. David Kuntz been patiently waiting.
I have a paradox.
A paradox.
Here the Israelites leave Egypt. They have the matzah. They can't wait for anything. There's no water out in the desert. There's no food. And now all of a sudden, they have acacia wood. They have the tools to do all this. They have the linens. They have the goat hair. This is pretty complicated artistry going on here in the middle of the desert. So can you help me reconcile that?
That's good because the desert is.
Yeah. So I think a couple things. I think it's a very fair question, but I think a couple things. One is that partially what's probably going on here is this is a description of something that existed long after the Exodus actually happened. This tabernacle, but the author of the text knows of the existence of this tabernacle, and so is sort of retroactively fitting it into the Exodus narrative, saying this tabernacle that we know of, they had it all the way back then. How else would the author know what it looks like? Right? They didn't have pictures. They didn't have pictures. They didn't have writing. There wasn't like blueprints or anything like that. So that's probably the easiest answer to your question. The time that the author is living and writing in, there is a tabernacle that exists, and he is taking the dimensions of that tabernacle, the way it operated, et cetera, and he's retroactively fitting it back into the period of the wandering.
Rambash, we call it a desert, but we also read that there are a lot of other groups that are there, the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Hittites, and is it possible that that the Israelites have can trade with these other groups
Sure.
to accumulate what these provisions?
That's possible. Sure. What are they trading?
The things that they left with something with Egypt. When they left Egypt, they had a lot of things.
The jewelry of the Egyptians. Yeah. Yeah, could be.
And I
Bob?
would like to further discuss one of Richie's ideas, and that is the God within us, or dwelling within us. It seems to me that another basic part of Judaism is derived from the passage of Jacob wrestling with the angel of God. And I've always interpreted that, and that's pretty early, of course, but I've always interpreted that as each individual wrestling with who their God is and their definition of God. And that in some ways that God is within them because they're creating a relationship of God with God and even imagining God within themselves. Although that may be my concrete example. So I do think that the concept of our carrying or containing some part of God within us goes way back.
Okay. All right. That's fair. I don't think it's like black and white, like in other words, there was none and then there was. And I think to your point, Bob, there was always something. I mean, people as individuals responded to the sense of mystery that they felt in the universe that called to them. And I'm sure that was the case then, and maybe even more so. But the idea of human psychology and an inner life, and how we understand that today, has changed over time for sure. I think
Yeah.
Shakespeare was a major piece of changing that, and then Freud, of course, and so I think that has changed, and I think that the sense of the importance of the individual has been dramatically elevated in the modern period, and in ancient times, it was exactly the opposite, that the importance of the individual was relatively low on the scale, certainly as compared to the importance of the national entity. But your point is fair. It's not a black and white thing for sure. Okay, I wanna Richie, do you have one quick thing and then
No, well, yes, but you go ahead. You go ahead.
okay. So I want to look at three quick explanations as to why the tabernacle kind of comes along at this point. I think I can share my screen, so let's try that. Yep. And you can see they come from classical commentators. Yeah. Excuse me, you have Rashi, you have Ramban, Nachmanides, and then you have Cassuto, who was an Italian commentator. And Rashi first brings up that idea that Judy said Ben and Cantor Emily had talked about in their Parsha discussion. There's Ein Mukdam U'Me'ochar BaTorah. There's no chronological order in the Torah, says Rashi. The story of the golden calf happened before the commandments to build the tabernacle were given. And in that sense, now, whether we sort of get on board with that idea or not, it was a pretty fundamental idea in rabbinic commentary that the Torah did not necessarily present things in chronological order, at least the way we would understand chronological order. And if the golden calf story is what is sort of the root cause of the tabernacle construction, then it seems to be about sort of physicality, that the people need some physical something. And to worship an idol is understood by the tradition as being entirely inappropriate. So the least you can do is switch the idol out and create some physical representation of God's presence and some physical place that the people can look to and go. And that becomes the tabernacle. And the hope being, once they have a physical something that they can connect to God and God's presence, then the temptation to worship idols will be diminished dramatically, right? That seems to be what Rashi has on his mind. Remember, by the way, as the tabernacle is described, and you'll remember that the top of the ark is a piece of hammered gold, supposed to be in the description in the Torah, one piece of hammered gold. What's on top of it?
Cherubim.
Yeah, these sort of angelic figures. And they face each other with their wings spread out toward each other, one facing the other. And the Torah says in a couple of different places, actually, that the voice of God emanated from that space. right? It's a pretty weird idea when you think about it. But again, that sense of some physical locus for God's presence. And even God seems to think about it like that in a way. Again, Richie, to your question about that verse 25:8. So you say, Vishachanti betocham, God's sort of saying, there's some of me that will be there, will be amongst them, right? And it almost sounds like, I mean, the pshat of the verse, the plain meaning would be it's physical. It's physical. Then you have Nachmanides, the Ramban, and he's writing on Exodus 25:1. Behold, the people are holy, fit for a sanctuary for God's presence to dwell among them. So the first thing God commands is the tabernacle, Mishkan, right? Shekhinah, Mishkan. It's the same word. Shachanti, Mishkan, Shechunah, Shekhinah. That there should be among them a house dedicated to God's name. So take a peek at Exodus 25:1, the very first verse of the Parsha. Well, you gotta go to 2. I mean, Daber al ben Esra veikhu li truma me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo tikhu et trumati. Exactly sure why he's reading it that way, but the sense being, at least according to Nachmanides, that they've sort of come through this moment at Sinai. They've received the laws. Now they're ready to be an Am Kadosh, holy people, and so they're fit to have a sanctuary. But you had to wait until that point. And then you have Ksuto, who has this interesting idea along the lines of what we were talking about before, where he says after they had witnessed the revelation and were about to go on their journey, drawing away from the site of the theophany, that's the revelation, so long as they were encamped at the mountain, they were conscious of God's nearness. Why? They could look up and they could see signs. He said, that's where it happened. It was right there. It was right there. It was only, remember, it was right there. The cloud and the noise and all that stuff. But once they set out on their journey, it seemed to them as if the link had been broken, unless they had a tangible symbol of God's presence in their midst. And he says that was the function of the tabernacle, literally dwelling, mishkan, dwelling, to serve as that symbol. Not without reason, therefore, does this section, Trumah, describe the tabernacle. Does it come immediately after the section that describes the making of the Brit, of the covenant? When Israel and the tabernacle are together, it is a natural extension of the bond that was forged at Sinai between Am Yisrael and God, right? So three ideas there. Any thoughts, questions?
Well, it shows Bobulus was correct in that you didn't know what Parsha was and didn't prepare anything.
Yeah, right.
The other thing that's interesting to me about this, and I think Rabbi Schwartz, you addressed this in the past, and that is that two things that always wanting to sort things out and know things exactly. One is what was given at Mount Sinai. Sometimes the Torah seems to say the Ten Commandments, and sometimes it says, all the laws that we see right away in Mishpatim were given at Sinai. So that's interesting. And I don't think there's an exact answer, if I'm correct about that. And then the other thing is, when they're describing the tabernacle, sometimes they're talking about the tent of meeting, and which is within the tabernacle, and sometimes they're referring to the whole tabernacle, which has the altar and the laver and the things outside the tent of meeting. So, is it true that it's not real clear sometimes what they're referring to, the tent of meeting itself within the tabernacle, but can that term also be used to mean the entire tabernacle?
Yeah, that does get confusing for sure. And it sometimes seems to be used interchangeably. But take a look. If you have, how many of you have the Eitz Chaim with you? Not everyone, but so just take a quick look. If you have the Eitz Chaim, go all the way to the back at page 1520.
Yeah.
And you have there a diagram of the tabernacle space and the tabernacle appurtenances. you can see the diagram, the technical diagram, which gives you the measurements and everything, and then below it, the drawing, which is sort of what it might have looked like. So if you're looking at the diagram, on the left-hand side of the diagram, it's a rectangle, right? Two equal squares making up a rectangle. And to the left side, you have that tent thing, which you can see in the drawing below. So it's covered over. In there, you have the lampstand, which would be the menorah. You have an incense altar, and then the ark itself, which would have been behind a screen there. And then to the right side, you have the altar, basically. But you'll notice there are three fundamental areas. He talks about this in the commentary below. The Holy of Holies, that's where the ark was, and I have it labeled that way. The holy place, which was inside that tented thing, but not behind the curtain. That's where the lampstand and the table were. And then you have the outer courtyard, which is where the altar was, but also considered to be sacred space. So there are three spaces of sort of ascending holiness, right? And that's in a way meant to reflect Sinai, back to Kasuto's point. So there were three areas of Sinai. There was the foot of the mountain where the people were. There was like halfway up the mountain where Aaron goes with the elders and Moses to have this weird happy hour. And then there's the top of the mountain, and only Moses went there. So they're like three areas of ascending holiness. And the access to the areas is somewhat restricted. It's limited. So only Moses to the top, only Aaron and the elders and Moses in that middle area.
Does Joshua get to the middle area as well?
I don't know. I'm not sure if that detail is contained in the text or not, Richie. You have to look it up.
That's okay. That's right.
Ben Kreshtel is standing here. He says he thinks so. So you know that the tabernacle is supposed to reflect Sinai in three areas of ascending holiness. And next time you're in Bethel's sanctuary, the Berman Reuben, you'll note that that also is supposed to reflect three areas of ascending holiness. You have the lower area, where the congregation sits, right? You walk up a set of steps, and then you have the sort of middle platform where the reading table is and the prayers are led. And then you have another set of steps, and that leads you to the ark. Right? That's done intentionally. So it's three different areas, three different levels. The steps, by the way, have different shapes, which was also done intentionally. But it's all done to reflect the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was made to reflect Sinai.
And are there 15 steps to initially up to the tabernacle? Is that?
In the temple, there were, Richie, in the tabernacle, there are no steps, right? Because there's no.
I mean, the temple.
Yes.
Do we have 15 as well?
I don't think so, but I don't think so. I'd have to go count it, though. I'm not sure. I should be able to do it from muscle memory. Gail, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that this whole tabernacle was designed to be portable. I mean, they had to take it apart and reassemble it and carry it through the desert for however many years. I mean, almost 40, I guess, right? And I was in a class on the Parsha this week, and the teacher used the analogy of IKEA, which seems a little bit disrespectful, but you have to be able to take it apart and put it back together yourself, which is described in great detail in other parshiot. But so the dwelling within them has to go with them wherever they go. It's not settled the way the temple was.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it is described, in such a way so that it can be movable. I would suggest not very easily, though. So two quick comments on that, and then I got to wrap it up. One is, remember that they didn't actually wander that much. Right? So when you go back and you see the wanderings in the wilderness, they weren't wandering every day. They would go somewhere and stay there for a long time. Then they would go somewhere else and stay for a long time. It wasn't, that they were like walking every day. There were a few major stops in the 40 years, right? So that's one thing. And then, Beverly, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is how long, how many miles, what did they actually get? Using it in terms when they walked for 40 years, it wasn't that many miles, you're saying. I mean,
nobody knows because we don't know exactly where they went.
Well, I know, but I mean, if you had to make an approximation, I mean, that's
no idea. Absolutely no idea. Yeah. If you want, you can look in the back of the Chumash, the Eitz Chaim, Beverly. There are a couple of different Exodus routes that are.
They didn't move that much. They were stationary for a certain period of time, a year or two. I don't know I'm not quite sure what you were saying in that respect.
Yeah, so they were not, so they would
not moving so much.
They would get to a place and they would set up camp and they would stay there for years. For years. They weren't walking every day.
In the sense that when there was nothing there left for them, they would have to move on like nomads.
Yeah, however they decided. But yeah, but you can think in your mind, every day they got to like take the tabernacle down and go march for a day. No, they didn't.
Okay.
They took it down and reassembled it every once in a while. It was more like that.
Thank you.
You may want to take a look at one of the more interesting things, and we were maybe going to get to this, but I didn't think we would. There is a scholarly comparison of the creation of the tabernacle and the story of creation at the beginning of Genesis. And there are 7 stages to the Genesis creation, right? Because it happens in 7 days. And there also are 7 stages to the creation of the tabernacle. And the stages are connected linguistically, stage by stage, by verbs that are used and things that happen. So, for example, in the second stage, in the creation story, and in the second stage in the Genesis story, I'll just give you those 2 verses. So in the Genesis story, it says, "For in 6 days God made heaven and earth." In the tabernacle story, it says, "The glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days." Right. So, and there are 7 of these connections. So it's worth looking into that if you can find it online. Okay, folks, I've gone too long. I have to run. I'm sorry. Thank you for joining as always. Have a great Shabbat, and we'll see you next time.